Welcome all. I'm joined today by Armen Kharazian, a former member of the Armenian Foreign Service. We'll be discussing Afghanistan and why it's important for Armenians to understand certain aspects of what's going on right now. So, Mr. Kharazian, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure to be here.
I want to start off by talking about something you wrote recently. You wrote the following: the problem was the failure of successive Afghan governments to exercise agency and the Afghan society's unsuccessful efforts to form a capable government that would. And the same problem, failure to exercise agency, is affecting Armenia as well. So can you explain what you meant by this and what can be done in Armenia with regards to this problem of agency?
Sure. Well, failure to exercise agency is the ability of a nation to determine its own policy in an informed manner based on a clear understanding of its objectives, of its resources, and a dynamic relationship between those resources and those objectives that can be constantly reassessed. It requires competence, requires discipline, requires a vision, and requires statesmanship. And so unless a nation has that process in place, it's going to be very difficult for that nation to address its foreign policy problems, no matter how much support the nation receives from the outside. And over time, the lack of agency and the lack of the ability to form a government that would exercise that agency will inevitably result in a breakup of the relationships that the nation had the opportunity to have with its foreign partners. Those partners will likely withdraw. And the national objectives will probably result in failure.
Mm-hmm. And we've been viewing what's going on in Afghanistan. Why do you think it's important for Armenians to understand or follow what's going on in Afghanistan?
For several reasons. I think we've seen a major U.S. commitment to Afghanistan. For 20 years, the United States was a presence, their military presence that began with 9/11 and a U.S. desire to make sure that Afghanistan does not continue to be a safe haven for terrorists. So U.S. intervention in Afghanistan and the removal of the Taliban from government gave Afghanistan a new opportunity to take advantage of the U.S. commitment, of the resources the United States brought to Afghanistan, and try to form a government that would represent the hopes and aspirations of the Afghan people for a peaceful, free, and prosperous nation. That didn't materialize. And now the U.S. has withdrawn. The Biden administration has come under criticism for its decision to withdraw. The timing and the manner in which that withdrawal was carried out has also been a target of criticism. But as I mentioned in my posting that you referred to, there's an underlying issue of agency. The failure of successive Afghan governments to exercise that agency. So whereas one may wonder what the value of a U.S. commitment is and why would nations in fact put their trust in a relationship with the U.S. when the U.S. can come, spend money there, make investments, policy investments, defense and economic, humanitarian. In the end, it doesn't work. The U.S. withdraws. What is the value of a relationship a nation builds with the United States? Can it really be trusted? And I would imagine that there would be those who would suggest that no, it can't be trusted. The United States comes, and when it fails, it exits, cuts and runs. But I think the more important lesson here is, why did the United States end up in that position? In my view, it's because the Afghans themselves failed to carry out their part of the bargain. They failed to exercise that agency. They failed to claim that agency, without which no one will be able to fix their country for them. They were the ones who were supposed to be able to take the opportunities that the United States presence afforded them and build a country, and they failed. So no matter how the United States, how hard the US tried, it was not going to succeed without that agency. I think this is the most important lesson, and that I would suggest the Armenians, the Armenian government, the Armenian public to look at and understand. It's not about the value of a commitment Armenia may have with the United States, or with any country for that matter. Russia could be another example. No matter how many agreements Armenia signs with Russia and how deep the Armenian-Russian relationship runs, without Armenia's active exercise of agency in that relationship, those commitments are not going to produce the kind of results that Armenia expects them to produce. And we saw that in the Artsakh war.
You mentioned the issue of agency, but there are also external factors. For example, the Taliban received major support from Pakistan, Iran, China, and Russia, allegedly. In terms of Armenia, there is external pressure from Azerbaijan, notably, and also from Turkey. So if you have both these factors, a lack of agency and external support, that must exemplify the problem, but isn't one, in a sense, greater than the other? In terms of Armenia, you have a government which has not been in power for very long, and a great deal of pressure from outside. So I'm wondering, do you think that kind of trumps the lack of agency, the external pressure coming from hostile countries?
I think the impact of that hostility is amplified by the lack of agency. Yeah. It's the lack of agency that produces that sort of an impact. Any country exercising any foreign policy is a subject to all those pressures. It's international politics, and politics is a world of anarchy and self-help. So you do come under all sorts of pressures from all sides. And the purpose of your policy is to try to mitigate those pressures, manage them, overcome them, and exercise your own set of pressures to pursue your own sets of interests and your own objectives. And if one fails in exercising that agency and projecting that policy, the only other dynamic that exists is external pressure. That inevitably leads to failure. So what I think Armenia needs to do is to understand where those pressures are coming from, to understand how they can be, what kind of measures can be taken to mitigate those pressures and overcome them. And go after the capacity that Armenia needs to have to counteract those pressures. Build capacity, do it with competence, do it in an informed manner, work with whoever Armenia needs to work with to build that capacity. If it's about knowledge, if it's about technology, if it's about planning, execution, strategy, identify the sources of those competencies, bring them together, and build on it. And once you take that first step, the second step will be it will be easier to see how the second step could be taken. So constantly set the objectives, get the resources, draw that connection, and try to make it dynamic and constantly reassess that. It's a process. It's a never-ending process. But it is that reassessment that's going to provide Armenia or any country with the ability to not simply counteract, but also shape the kind of environment it wants to have around itself to go after its national objectives, to shape a more favorable security, defense, and economic environment to pursue its national interests.
And some analysts were saying that the Afghan government was complacent partly because of the US presence and a reliance on US forces. Could that also be applied to Armenia in terms of its relationship with Russia? For example, that there is a lack of agency because Armenia has relied on a commitment from a foreign power instead of creating competence at home.
You know, there's a different nature to the US presence in Afghanistan compared to the Russian presence and influence in Armenia. The US went to Afghanistan to save Afghanistan from having it fall into the hands of terrorists and from becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. It was not just the Taliban, but also an international terrorist network that had found a refuge there and a fertile ground to launch a global jihadist operation that was deployed against the United States on 9/11. So when the United States went to Afghanistan, the nature of that intervention was to help Afghanistan reclaim its agency, reclaim its independence, sovereignty. Granted, part of why Afghanistan became what it became, and there were many reasons that we may or may not go into, but Pakistan next door was a major third party with interest in what we saw was happening in Afghanistan and with influence over that dynamic. So the US went into Afghanistan to try to help Afghanistan assert some form of independence from Pakistan by the virtue of US presence, and also reclaim its agency to prevent it from becoming a place where Al-Qaeda and the Taliban would run the affairs. The Russian presence in Armenia has a very different flavor and tenor to it. It's not, whereas the rhetoric may as well be about Russia and Armenia working together to help Armenia maintain its independence, I would argue that Armenia's relationship with Russia and the kind of commitments that Armenia has entered into with respect to Russia have in fact resulted in a much more vulnerable stage for Armenia's independence and its ability to exercise sovereignty over its own territory. So the Armenian-Russian relationship in that sense follows an opposite dynamic. We may go into the reasons for that and how to fix that and whether that was the only way this relationship could have turned out. But the way it works now is it acts as a major firewall for Armenia to diversify its relations with the rest of the world and build a capacity that would enable it to exercise better self-defense.
And you also have written the following: the key question is not how others act, but how Armenia acts to influence developments that matter to its national interest and the quality with which it does so. How can Armenia expect to grapple with this problem? What do you think Armenia needs to do which it is not doing?
Set national goals, make sure that those goals are realistic, based on an informed understanding of not simply what Armenia is able to do now, but what it can potentially do if it were to also put an effort to understand, organize, and augment its resources that it can dedicate to those policy objectives. So again, it's a strategy that works through a dynamic relationship between the goals one sets and the resources one has available, but also one's own understanding of how those resources can be amplified, can be built on, and what policies the country needs to have to make sure that those resources continue supporting objectives that are subject to a dynamic change as well, because we're not the only ones that shape that environment, in the security environments within which we run a country. Everything that there's a large number of factors that influences that environment. So if a country doesn't act proactively, doesn't assess its risks, threats, vulnerabilities, opportunities, and doesn't constantly work to bring forth the resources and support the way those resources could be used to pursue those objectives, the country is likely not going to be able to influence influence that dynamic. Everyone else would continue shaping the environment in which a country exists, except for that country. That's what I call lack of agency, or failure to exercise agency. Failure to understand, anticipate, not just respond, but shape the kind of environment that one needs to have around itself to be able to successfully pursue its national objectives. Be proactive in doing it. So that's I think what Armenia needs to do to even now today in this situation that Armenia finds itself in. There are many things that Armenia can do in terms of understanding what its risks are, how to mitigate them, how to shape a better, a more favorable, an environment more conducive to our national aspirations, our national goals, and set those goals in a realistic manner, but in a way that would respond to change. And again, the key question that all of this should rely on is how does one find the resources to support these goals?
And you've spent time in the United States. Do you think the United States ultimately underestimated the issue of agency in Afghanistan, and that was partly why we saw this whole fiasco in Kabul and in the airport, for example?
Yes, I think there's an understanding, there's a realization that successive US administrations could have done a better job in bringing together the kind of cultural competence, military competence, strategic ability to manage change in a country like Afghanistan that they needed to have to arrive at a different outcome. However, this was not entirely about a US success or failure. This was a nation that should have exercised its own agency again and work with the United States for that goal to succeed. No matter how much the United States tried, even though I do agree that the US could have done better, again, in terms of cultural competence, doing more to prevent corruption and waste that was also a constant feature of the continued US presence in Afghanistan over these 20 years. So all of that is there. Yes, that's a problem, but that doesn't take away what also needed to be there for this effort to succeed, and that's how the people of Afghanistan, how well they were prepared to take advantage of the US presence and to really work with the US while they had access to those resources, to that commitment, both military and political, to fix the country. And that's where the effort strategically lacked.
Do you think the same realization is occurring in Armenia?
I wish we here in Armenia have that had insight into why the US policy in Afghanistan resulted in its withdrawal, where we have seen the Taliban come back to power, having been the kind of regime that the US went in to take from power. So yes, we came full circle, Taliban are back in government, the US is out. And the reason was Afghanistan's failure again to exercise agency, to claim it. Armenia may find itself in that same position. Armenia's problems are different. We're talking about a nation that seems to have a very hard time overcoming a post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD of sorts as a result of the 44-day war. The soon Armenia collects itself and deploys the willpower, resolve, and the competence to overcome this stress, the better. A further delay is going to be, I believe, detrimental for Armenia's ability to even bring together the kind of competence it still has.
And finally, many are hoping that Armenia will now diversify its foreign policy. Can you explain what is meant by the diversification of foreign policy? And at the same time, aren't there also risks coming from that strategy of diversifying?
I believe, of course, there are risks, and those risks need to be identified, assessed. Mitigation strategies should be explored and managed, deployed and managed, because every policy comes with a risk. And again, it all depends on what the national idea is, what the national strategy is, what is the national objective. Whether it's the Artsakh problem, how does Armenia want the Artsakh? How does Armenia envisage the resolution of the Artsakh problem? What does it need to have to ensure that that objective is materialized? How does one pursue a policy that would result in that objective? In achieving that objective. So that it's a methodological question. It's again about setting the proper objectives and looking for the resources to support those objectives. If you have a policy, you have to be able to pay for it. If you don't have the money to pay for it, you go and seek ways to find the money to pay for it. It could be through a partnership relationship with a foreign power. It can also be through an economic policy that helps the state raise revenue and pay for the program. But the connection between resources and objectives needs to be very clear and functional and informed and realistic. And when I say realistic, I don't rule out a cushion of potentiality in how one sets those objectives, because these objectives are dynamic. They are influenced by events around us, but those events can also be influenced by our actions. So putting all of that in a dynamic perspective to see how the events around us are shaping up and how we can influence that dynamic, I think is critical in order to understand how best to manage that relationship between resources and objectives and how constantly reassess them. That's what the national security process is about. It's a cycle. It's a never-ending, continuous cycle of reassessment, evaluation, and change. And if you stop doing that, you have a breakdown in your national security planning and defense planning. When you have a breakdown, you find yourself in a position Armenia found itself in, where Armenia lost the war that it spent 30 years building assumed capacity to prevent from happening, or to prevail if it were to happen. I think the reason we saw what happened was because we had a breakdown in our national security and defense planning.
Well, Mr. Kharazian, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And continue following CivilNet.